Well, the oral history collections of the Fashion Institute of Technology, and particularly for the project relating to the oral history of the school itself, this will be an interview with Dean Marion Brandress, who retired from FIT in February, as of February 1, 1973. The date is December 19th, 1984. The interviewer is Mildred Finger. So, tell me, Dean Brandress, when did you start at the school, actually? What year did you come to the school?
You're referring to FIT?
To FIT.
1944.
1944, the very moment that it was born, so to speak.
Right.
Well, then let's go further back and talk about you and where and when you were born and how you finally came to this institution.
Well, actually, I started as a teacher of English, and after graduation from Cornell University, I did some substitute teaching in the city, and then was appointed to the Central High School of Needle Trades.
Mm-hmm.
And there I taught English for a while until the concept of FIT came to Mortimer C. Ritter, who was then the principal of the high school, and whose dream was the Fashion Institute. He doesn't get too much credit for it these days, but it was his baby, his idea, his creation. He was a very astute man. He was able to pull from the faculty of the high school those people he thought could do a good job in starting his new school. I remember in 43, possibly, maybe even earlier, he would call some of us into his office and remove from his safe architecture drawings of the new school. And we all thought it was ridiculous, it was a mirage, it would never come to pass, but it did. And in the spring of 44...
I'm sorry, how many years were you at the high school for needle trades?
4 to 5.
Oh, yeah, 4 to 5 years.
Yeah. And the high school, incidentally, had moved from 24th Street to its new building. Perhaps I have the streets wrong, but anyway, to its new building. And when FIT first started, we occupied the first 2 floors of the high school building. But going back to the spring of 44, Mr. Ritter called me into his office and said, I want you to get the first 100 students for the Fashion Institute. No, I don't even think it had a name at that time, but I'm not sure. And in order to entice these students to come, we will give each one a $10 a week scholarship. Now, may I say that prior to this, although I had no direct involvement, there were some postgraduate classes in the high school, led by Dorothy Donnelly and Helen Clubb, both now gone.
How do you spell club?
K-L-U-P-T.
Thank you.
And these graduates would come from high schools to learn more in the way of fashion illustration and drawing. Essentially, it was drawing for those two. And it was really from this germ that the whole idea of FIT developed, and Mr. Ritter's concept of a college that would serve the fashion industry. Well, going back, in the spring of 44, then, I visited high schools all over the city, Long Island and Westchester. And I think back now, I don't know how I did it, but I did it. And you have to remember that in those days, the concept of a 2-year college was anathema. It seems strange that in 40 years this tremendous change has come about, but the good high schools, when I say good, I mean good academic high schools, stuck their noses up at a 2-year institution. They were not interested. So it was a real tough fight to get into the schools, to allow them to, get them to allow me to talk to their students, and then to convince some of them who were interested in art and design that here was a new school ready to take a chance on them to the tune of $10 a week
Where was that money going to come from? We haven't talked
from the industry.
from
As
the
far as-
industry.
I really wasn't
No,
too
no,
much concerned
right.
with that. I was simply told that this is what would happen. But I know now that it came from the industry. Some schools, such as the High School of Science, wouldn't even let me in. But the High School of Music and Art did, and we had some of our first students from that school. On Long Island, the reception was very poor. 2-year college. We're talking about middle class, even upper middle class, and they wouldn't dream of 2-year institutions. So I didn't fare too well then in '44, and the same was true in Westchester. But somehow, I managed to get 100 students to come in.
What were your criteria? I mean, how did you feel about
Well, the students had to be interested, of course, in this whole field, number one. They had to be fairly good academic students because we always had academic subjects involved. And they had to show some of their artwork or their designs. And at that time, I think Miss Donnelly looked at some of the artwork, and Mrs. Kopp, who was one of the first, who was part of that group of 10, looked at some of the apparel if they had it. Mainly, though, they had artwork.
I'm sorry, COP is K-O-P-P.
Yes, Erna Kopp. I also taught in those days, in '44. Half of my time was devoted to teaching, and my title at that point was Director of Admissions. So that my main responsibility was getting those students in. And
And there were 10 of you all together on staff.
that's right. 10, pretty sure that's the number. And after they came in, their programs were assigned. Actually, there wasn't very much. It was apparel design and art, essentially, and English. History of civilizations we always gave with Dr. Zucker. Who's also gone now.
Z-U-C-K-E-R.
Yes, he was a international figure in the history of art. And the academic subjects and the technical work, whether I had some help that or not, I don't know. I don't remember at least. And that was the beginning. And each week I would dole out $10 a week checks, which in '44 enabled them to buy their supplies. And that was the beginning. The second year, when I went out to get additional students, it still wasn't much easier. The 2-year institution had not yet gained much headway. But I traversed the island in Westchester, getting lost very frequently in my journeys. And I said the next year, actually it was February, we admitted twice a year in those days for several years, in September and February, and brought in more students who were reasonably happy while they were here doing the kind of work that they loved to do. We provided some form of student activities at the time. That was one of my responsibilities as well. And there was a very popular room called Maya Hall in the old building where the students used to congregate to smoke and chat and give their parties. The library and all the facilities, of course, were high school facilities, which rubbed people the wrong way a little bit, but we tried to keep our people on their 2 floors separated from the high school group. The curriculum in those days was developed slowly by the people in charge. I remember very distinctly Rosalind Snyder and I trying to develop the business management curriculum. We felt the best place to go was to MIT. And so I remember bringing in the catalog from MIT, from which we etched out a management program. There were very few men in those days. It was very hard to interest men in these programs, even
You
though,
mean them as students?
as students,
Uh-huh.
even though the need for men in management was always there. We pretty soon outgrew our office and classroom space in the high school building, and plans were afoot to build a new building, which came ultimately in 1959.
Now say it.
Prior to that, after our first graduation in 1946, where the student placement was excellent, word began to filter through to the high schools, and gaining admission to speak to students was getting a little bit easier. It was still a tough job because the community college still had not been recognized. But by 1951, when we received the status of community college under the State University of New York, entree was made a little bit easier. And applications for admission grew steadily. And finally, I needed more help to sift through the application blanks. And in addition, the art people and the design people wanted some evidence of the student's ability. So we instituted some kind of tests for these people. Either they were to bring in some samples of work that they had done, or later in the case of illustration, the chairman definitely wanted them to do work on the premises so that he could be sure it was their own.
Oh, that's interesting. In other words, he had thought there might be a possibility that somebody would bring work which was not.
No, right. That was always a risk. But they did that. They did that later.
Mm-hmm.
We began to develop admissions officers who would go out to speak to some of the high schools. And as the years passed, we were not only made more welcome, but we were actually invited to speak, because placement was always excellent and the students were extremely happy. It was one characteristic of FIT. The students were finally and at last doing the work that they loved to do. And this made
And on a level that they...
a very warm relationship with the faculty, which has never been duplicated. We had a much smaller group, of course, and the faculty was the most devoted you would find anywhere. Hours meant nothing. We came early and we stayed late. And the faculty itself worked very, very closely with the students. Finally, I don't recall the year, my teaching was dropped and I became Director of Admissions and Student Personnel. That meant that admissions, programming, placements, health, all student personnel services came under my jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
Then when the dormitory was built, of course, that too became a part of my work. As the fame of FIT spread and more people became aware of the excellent placement opportunity, we started to get people not only from the city and the metropolitan area, but from the whole state and from high schools in other states in the Union. I myself spoke to other high schools around, not only the metropolitan area, but in different states. I wouldn't go too far, but I remember going to New Jersey and Virginia, Connecticut, and gradually these students came and applied, and many were accepted at FIT. Then housing became an enormous problem. New York City being the kind of city it is, it wasn't very easy to find places for these students. And for a long time, we housed them in one of the hotels nearby. That offered tremendous headaches. And
most of your students must have been pretty young to go to hotels.
well, they were 18,
hotels.
19.
Yeah, right.
We had I remember what we called it. It was some kind of counselor that stayed with them both at the hotel, and then later, when plans were made for the new dormitory, we were able to get the equivalent of counselors or house mothers at the dorm. In those years, I was pretty strict with the rules and regulations of the new dormitory, and visiting hours for young men were curtailed. Men could not stay in girls' rooms. All this, of course, I understand has changed radically since then. But when
when you talk about boys and girls, what was the ratio as the years went on between men and women in the school?
There were very few men in the design areas. There were some, but not many. Most of the men were concentrated in management, production management. And the ratio was always very lopsided. My offhand guess was 10 and 90, which became 20 and 80, and maybe 30 and 70. The best, I would say, it ever became 60-40.
60 women, 40 men.
I don't even think it was that many. It was very hard to interest young men, but I remember the exact year I'm not sure of, but it was very early, 46, 47. I went to Stuyvesant High School, which after all is the plum in New York City. And they let me speak to a group of seniors, and a few of them came. Mm-hmm. Went into management and did extremely well as the years have gone by. But it was always a tough struggle to get men into the management areas.
Were some of your students the children or grandchildren of people in the industry?
In some cases, yes. Mm-hmm. They were children of workers. But my memory is not that clear as to how most of them were youngsters who simply wanted to design clothes, mm-hmm. Later make textile designs. They had art ability, but they knew they would never become great commercial artists. And yet they were tremendously interested in clothes. Now the men who were interested in clothes, and there were always a few, had been fighting their parents and their friends their whole lives because it was called sissy stuff, and they were frowned on as being too effeminate. Mm-hmm. But if they stuck to it and came to FIT and went through the classes, they were, by and large, very, very successful. And so admissions grew. Our applications became far more than we could accommodate, even after the new building. And I was given several admissions counselors, as I said.
I say, when did you stop paying the $10? A long time ago.
I would say it went on to 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, maybe by 50. Mm-hmm. They no longer had that incentive. Of course, however, we did gradually have student aid, mm-hmm. which came in later from the federal government, but we always had some aid from the industry. People who were willing to donate money to the Educational Foundation. Mm-hmm. And I was able to that was another one of my jobs, to dispense money to those who needed it. Then came federal assistance with their forms and their requirements, and we ultimately got a financial aid advisor. So it grew gradually through the years with more work in student activities, mm-hmm. so that ultimately we had an assistant dean in charge of student activities. More admissions, programming. I used to program the entire college myself. The first
what
few
do you mean
years.
Program?
Setting up the classes, who was going to teach them, who was going to take them.
Really? That's enormous.
It was. I remember laying out the cards on my dining room table and doing it all. But, of course, ultimately it became too big a job. We got a right. Slips me, but someone in charge of programming, and a registrar is the word I want, and then student records became very voluminous and more important, and recommendations to industry. Gradually, too, some few of the students wanted more training.
Mhm.
and a few went on to higher ed where they could get their BA or their BS degree. Of course, that's no longer necessary now.
I mean, that we go out of the school and to other schools.
That's right.
But the upper program, the 1-year extension, did come about somewhere in this.
Yes, that was the beginning of work after FIT. There was a 1-year program developed for graduates of colleges, and from that program we had a great deal of interest from out-of-town students. I remember hoping and fighting for a MA degree in those years, especially for teachers who could come for a 1-year program. But Albany said no. Albany has subsequently changed its mind, of course.
No, I'm not sure I know what you mean. They've changed their mind about what?
Because now you can have an MA program from FIT.
Oh, right. That is to say you're going to be able to. I don't think it's in
I
yet.
thought it was in.
No, I don't think so. I don't think
Are
it
you
has
sure?
started yet. I'm not positive, but I believe not.
Mr. Feldman said it was, but maybe
Or
I'm
perhaps
wrong.
next September, but
Maybe,
not
maybe.
yet, yeah.
Anyway, the 1-year program was successful for a long time. They didn't have to take academic subjects because they already had more than we offered. And so they just concentrated in the year on the design elements. And that was quite successful.
What about the evening program? When did that start?
I don't know when the evening program started, nor do I know too much about it. I was not directly involved with it at any time.
How were the students for that admitted to the evening?
Dick
if you
Ma
were-
would have to give you the answer to that.
Who?
Dick Ma, M-E-A-G-H-E-R. He's been in charge of the evening division for many years. Not the first one, but many years. And
I would gather then that became important enough to require the services of somebody who did nothing but.
Oh, yes. I was never involved in evening division. Al Wagner was there. I think he was the first one. And then I think Dick Ma was the second.
Mhm.
The expansion of the evening program has been very, very great through the years. Okay.
Well, these were then industry people already in the industry, I assume. who-
Not always,
Not
but at
always.
least people who were working and were hoping someday to get into industry.
Mhm, mhm. And of course, also there were people who were just taking one course, I assume, and not planning to matriculate for a degree.
That's right. There was some going from evening to day, but very few, very
Mhm.
few. Most of them had to earn money and were working at it. Were hoping to upgrade themselves
Mhm.
in the industry. See what else I have.
You know, it's interesting. You seem to have been a woman who did anything that needed to be done in addition to the admissions.
For a long time, that
Yeah,
was true.
right. Were you just illustrating? Could you illustrate that with one of the stories you told me?
Well, as a matter of fact, you can tell somewhat from my title and the change. When we started, I was director of admissions. Subsequently, I became director of admissions and student personnel, and finally received the title of dean of students. At the very beginning, I did everything. I programmed the school. I helped the faculty members, especially those who came from the outside, such as Dr. Zucker, who had an international reputation in the field of history of art, but was nonplussed with the teaching situation as he found it. The students were not gung-ho for history of art in the first place. This was one of his chief duties. They didn't know the Bible, which he simply could not understand. And he had such trouble with small things. I took his attendance for him. I opened the windows for him. I helped him run the machines. All of this was beyond him. Another person who came from the outside was Eleanor Herrick, who too was quite an authority in her field. A wonderful
What was
lady.
her field?
Labor relations she ultimately became. That was what it was. And But she was much better adapted to the classroom setup. I didn't have to do too much for her except to get her started and show her how to take the attendance and that kind of thing.
I assume then that in those days, academic requirements were not really in place for the instructors. I mean, they didn't have to have a degree in education or a degree in something else that would be relevant to teaching.
They certainly needed the background.
Yeah.
That's
For
what
example,
mean,
you
but
talked
they
about
didn't-
Dr. Zucker. He did not have a degree in education.
No, but he has taught elsewhere.
Right,
I suspect he taught in Germany as well. Something else that, coming back. Turn it on. One of the things that I did and felt that was very valuable, two things, as a matter of fact. I interviewed all the students who came, who applied. And I did that right through until my retirement, with the feeling that the students, one, must know what the institution offers, and two, you must be very keenly aware of the interest that the student has. This wasn't a place where you could fool around. You had to come, you had to attend, you had to do your work, and they had to be very, very serious about it. Another thing that I did was to call the home if the students were absent for an excessive period of time. And the reason I did that was there was no way of making up the work. If you missed a week in apparel design, forget it. You just couldn't make it up. Now, sometimes the parents didn't know that the student wasn't attending school. So that was a shock for the parents and subsequently, I imagine, for the students. But it was a way of showing our genuine interest in the students and their accomplishments. I remember the story, which I shall never forget, of the daughter of one of the faculty members who went to the dean of students at a university. She knew me, and she knew the kind of work I was doing here. And she asked to see the dean of students at this university, and she was told that the dean of students doesn't see students. Which, of course, was the exact opposite of what I had done in all the years I was here. To me, the students were the most important and the most relevant. And if they wanted to see me or I had to see them because of problems that they had, this came first. After a while, of course, we did develop a guidance department, among other things, that was also under my jurisdiction, where they were able to bring students in who had problems, help them over some of the difficult things that they were facing, trying to solve.
Incidentally, when you speak of guidance, did the school start a remedial program during your time? I mean, remedial reading, remedial writing? No, it was not.
Not at the very beginning. We needed it subsequently. Before I left, there was a great deal of remedial work being done because you have to remember that then we were reaching out for minority groups.
Yes, well, that's what I was interested in.
People who were not so well qualified for college, etc. But when you talk about 44, 46, 48, we have never really matched some of those students. They were just tremendous.
But as time went on, because we're not talking only about the very earliest
As time
years.
went on, and we opened our doors more and more to minority groups, and also to those students who had a great deal of talent, but academically were very weak. You had to make a decision there. And some of them never did get through FIT academically and couldn't get our degree. But the talent was there. And those were some of the tough decisions that had to be made. In recent years, where the doors have opened much wider, they have had a great deal of remedial work, and from what I gather, it's been quite successful.
What was your relationship with the with the other administrative people? For example, in the early days, was there a great deal of contact with the president of the school and with other
If you're
members?
talking about Mr. Ritter, yes.
Yes,
It was a great deal. I told you earlier, he had a great knack for picking the right people.
Right.
In Rosalind Snyder, he had a splendid administrator, and later when, and the faculty was chosen essentially from those who had shown their merit and their skills in the high school.
Mm-hmm.
The chairman of the departments and I worked very closely together because I picked the students that they were going to develop.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore their needs and desires and wants were made known to me. We discussed the students who came in and how good they were, etc. When we developed the various areas, student activities, dormitory, the registrar, financial aid, etc., I was conferring with those people all the time as they did less and less of the detailed work.
Right. What happened during what kind of periods of transition did you have, let's say? Well, President Mortimer died rather soon after FIT was established, really.
Mhm.
What kind of a transition was there between him and the next president?
With Lawrence Bethel.
Yes,
And,
right.
Well, by that time, practically speaking, I guess, we were pretty well, and we were enlarged, and we would meet with him periodically and discuss curriculum and how to get more students, how to get more money, and that kind of thing. When Jarvie came afterwards, the same kind of thing happened. Their contacts were rather with what I was doing and what were the results, but they weren't involved in the details of the running of the shop,
Right.
so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
When we moved to this building, well, not this building, but the old building here on 27th Street, there was a big change. Each of us had offices now, and we were able to spread out the work more effectively, that's for sure. And then many of the departments inaugurated many of their exciting programs, study in England, and more money came in so that we could offer more prizes at graduation and help the students while they were in school so that they could get additional aid from us as well as aid from the federal government.
What was the story with the cost to the students of their being students here? How much was when did the practice begin of charging tuition? Right.
The year I couldn't tell you. Of course, at the beginning there was no tuition charge.
And you were paying them
gave
$10
money.
a week, right?
Then, quite a while later, tuition was charged. I have no idea anymore of the date, but the business office would know that. And their expenses for supplies were always great. They had to buy fabrics, they had to buy paint, they had to buy books, of course, but that was relatively unimportant. Well, small, I should say, not unimportant, but a small fee compared to fabrics and paints and other things that they needed.
Are you at all familiar with the program of critiques by the people in the market?
Yes, that started too under Jay Watkins, and she did a tremendous job in bringing designers in to lecture and assist our design students. That came, imagine, somewhere along the 50s. I'm aware of the program. I was not involved in it in any way.
Right. And a program such as Dorothy Hannenberg has conducted for the Community Resources Department, and
Well, that's the one I'm referring to, but it was started by Jay Watkins.
I see.
And Dorothy Hannenberg has just taken it over and enlarged it. But the initial idea was Jay's, and yes, she worked with Virginia Pope first, I would say. That's what started it.
Yes.
And then, long before Virginia died, Jay took it over, enlarged it, and now it's, of course, just splendid on its own.
Right. Yeah. And Do you know anything about the Alumni Association? Did you have contact with the students once they were alumni? Or is that no longer part of your...
Well, a little bit, yes. That was for a while. I was in charge of that. And we had Molly Wincour running the Alumni Association. But, no, I wasn't doing too much with that.
Mm-hmm.
And toward the end, not at all, actually.
Well, now, toward the end, your time was pretty well spent, pretty much spent with the whole admissions process. Is that right? Yeah.
Was.
Because by then, admitting a couple of thousand students,
Right,
a year
right.
had to be an enormous
Yeah,
job.
I was no longer even interviewing, I don't think, by the time I left. We then had several admissions officers
Mhm,
who were doing work.
Mhm, mhm.
Well, I covered that. Programming was done by somebody, and
Yeah, so as the school grew, I assume the functions were all then, the functions that you had performed alone were divvied up
were
among...
divided up,
Yeah.
and I had overall jurisdiction.
Right.
of-
Right.
But we were becoming, certainly in the art areas, more and more particular about, as we could be once the student applications increased, about what the students brought in.
Mhm.
And there was a long process of having all their work examined, what they did here and what they brought in from the outside.
Mhm, mhm.
But it was all done, and I don't know if it's still being done or not.
Well, I think that, I don't know what the admissions requirements are today, I must say, actually. I think I'll have to find out I sort of have that brought up to date, because certainly with the numbers of students who are admitted today, there must be a much more elastic kind of admissions program, I would think.
On the other hand, if the student doesn't have this innate ability in the design areas, they're not much worth much, and they shouldn't be coming here.
Mhm,
It was
mhm.
one of the things why I always felt interviewing was so important, to be sure they knew what they were getting into.
Mhm.
Otherwise, it was a tremendous waste of time and money
Mhm.
for them.
Right. What happened when a new department was added to the school? I'm thinking specifically of fashion buying and merchandising, which is today probably the biggest department of the school. What happened when that was instituted? How did that affect the desire for admissions on the part of students?
When fashion buying and merchandising was first introduced, in fact, from the very beginning, it went ahead in leaps and bounds. Students in the high schools were extremely interested in this area, and apparently the department stores were extremely interested in getting these students. No sooner was the department started, and I don't recall the year, but thereafter there was always an enormous number of applicants. It should be remembered that the motivation of all our students, certainly in those early years, and I hope it still should, was very, very great. They knew what they wanted. I always claimed we had the most highly motivated students of any college in the country. These students knew what they wanted. They were willing to pursue the careers until they got there. An interesting thing about the name of the institution, Mortimer C. Ritter wanted from the very beginning a name similar to MIT.
Oh.
And he came up with FIT, although we knew that if anything it should be the Institute of Fashion Technology. But he wouldn't budge.
He wanted to
He
sound
wanted to sound like MIT. And even, I think maybe in the 60s, when there was a movement afoot to change the name of the institution, I remember Gotham was the name suggested. Somehow everybody by that time liked the sound and the flavor of FIT,
Oh, absolutely.
and it has become that. But if you think about it seriously, it's almost meaningless.
But it is interesting, in New York, if you talk to you say, well, cab driver, I want to go to FIT, they
He knows
almost
it
always
now.
know. You don't have to be more specific than just those three letters, and they
Right.
know. Well, thank you very much. That's been very interesting, and I enjoyed
I'm
hearing all about
sorry
the early
that
days.
my memory doesn't hold up for dates, but after all, I've been out 10 years, 11 years, I think, my husband was born.
Yes, right, yeah. No, that's fine, and where there are dates that need to be filled in, I will get them. Okay, and attribute them to this.
The funny thing about that story on MIT was the fact that when Rosalind and I had to set up the curriculum for the management program, I immediately went to MIT. And it was only many years later that my own daughter got her doctorate from MIT.
Oh.
The whole thing was linked together.
That's the way, the funny thing sometimes how,
Right.
life works. Thanks very much.